Common table expressions, or CTEs, are a simple code organizational tool for when you're working with table subqueries. They don't fundamentally introduce any new functionality, but they can be used to improve the readability of your SQL code. When you're working with table subqueries, you might have noticed that your queries can start to get quite messy, especially if you've got several table subqueries in play at once. CTEs allow you to pull out the table definition in advance, and that can improve the readability of your code. Let's look at a simple example. When we were talking about table subqueries, we looked at an example where we were calculating the number of times a film would need to be rented to break even. This is the query here. And we introduced a table subquery so that we could calculate this new derived column called break even and reference that in our where clause. What common table expressions allow us to do is pull out that table subquery definition and append it to the top of the query. Let's apply that here. We start a CTE definition with the keyword with, and then we specify the table name. In this case, I'm going to call the table film stats, and then we use the as keyword, and inside the parentheses now, we place the table subquery, the definition for the table. So I'll pull this table subquery here up to the top and paste it in, clean up the formatting a little bit. So what this essentially does is define a table called film stats, and the rows and columns for film stats come from this table subquery. After introducing this CTE, we can now refer to it in our queries just as if it were a regular table. Let's remove the old query now. And now let's run this. And looking at our results, we can see it's exactly what we expect. We've simply selected all of the columns from the film stats table, where film stats is defined by this table subquery. So now, to finish off the query to return it to what it was doing before, what we simply need to do is filter for where the break even is greater than 30. And that works just the same. It's important to note that this hasn't fundamentally changed the way the query works. Whenever you see a reference to a table that's defined by a CTE, so when we're saying from film stats here, you can simply imagine that the table subquery has been pasted in here. Nothing else has changed. It's simply been a convenient code organization tool that's allowed us to move the definition from deeply embedded within the query to up the top where it's a little bit clearer and it's a little bit easier to read and see what's going on. As it is now, all of the columns that are in the film status table are defined by this select clause. If you want though, you can redefine or alias the column names. So if we wanted to, for example, expose simpler and shorter column names to any subsequent queries, what we can do is redefine them up here in parentheses. So let's call them T, RR for rental rate, RC for replacement cost, and BE for break even. Once we've done this, we now have to come down here to our query, and we can no longer refer to this break even column. It's been redefined as BE. We can run that, and that runs just the same. Something that is quite cool when it comes to CTEs is that you can actually have multiple CTE definitions. And each CTE that you define can refer to previous CTEs. So if you have a particularly complex piece of SQL code where you've got subqueries and you maybe even have nested subqueries within that, CTEs can be a really nice way to break those out rather than trying to parse and understand particularly complex nested subqueries. Once again, let's look to a previous exercise that we've done, and let's have a look at how we could use multiple CTEs to clarify and simplify the code. So we'll start things off with our query, which we were using to calculate the average number of rentals on any given day of the week. So on Sunday, we averaged 464 rentals, Saturday 462, and so on, for every day of the week. And for this query, what first happens is there's a table expression which is used to aggregate the rentals by date. Once the rentals are aggregated by date, they're subsequently aggregated by the day name, and then the average is calculated on that. So let's first separate out this inner subquery where we're aggregating by date into its own CTE. And we'll call it day counts. And so we'll pull out this subquery definition. And now down here, we can simply refer to day counts. Let's now create a second CTE following this first CTE, which performs the aggregation by the day of the week. And when you introduce a second CTE, you don't need to use the with keyword anymore, and you simply separate the definitions with a comma. So I'll call this second CTE day of the week counts, and again I use the as keyword to introduce the definition, and I put the definition here in parentheses. And what's really neat now is that within this definition, I can refer to the table day counts because it's already been defined. So I'll move this entire query now into day of the week counts. And we'll indent it just for readability. And now let's just have a look what we've got. Let's select all of the columns from the table day of week counts. And we've got the same results that we saw earlier. And maybe let's even introduce a new filter condition as well, to filter for where the average is greater than 450. And we can run that, and we can see that that's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Those are the busiest days of the week, which is what you'd expect for film rentals. If you compare what we have now to our original query, it's actually quite a bit longer in terms of lines of code, but it is actually, I would argue, easier to read and understand. You can walk through and think about small snippets of code a bit at a time. You would likely have noticed so far when you're working with SQL that it can be actually quite dense, and even a small snippet of SQL code can actually contain a lot of subtlety and nuance. It's a language which allows you to pack a lot of complexity into very few lines of code. Personally, I see CTEs as just being a nice counteracting force to that. It will make your query longer, but it can very often make your query easier to read, easier to understand, and therefore easier to maintain as well. And so in my own SQL, I tend to quite liberally use CTEs. There is one place though where CTEs can actually save you quite a few lines of code, and that's if you've got a situation where you've got a quite complex self-join query. You can just define the table subquery once, and then refer to that multiple times in your query, rather than having to repeat the same definition over and over again. That's really handy, particularly if your definition has several joins. And you'll look at just such a situation in the exercises for this video.